Here we go. Are you all able to see this? Excellent. So I'm going to start with something that I did last semester. I taught a course in French that was about the graphic novel in French. And the whole class was about the theme of the other in graphic novels written in French. My students got really excited about this because they thought that we were just going to play with a lot of cartoons. What they ended up discovering is things like Hergé, who is a Belgian cartoonist, born in 1907, passed in 1983. You all know Tintin, right? And notice here, Tintin in the Congo. So you see Tintin and his very cute dog Milou, accompanied by the Congolese, so the African, the black man, who has very thick lips. And notice also the scenery behind Tintin in this old car, right? So there's a giraffe. There's a lot of emptiness in the scenery. Now I move on to the crab in the middle here. And notice Tintin is on a camel, an animal that is has become a symbol of depicting the Middle East. And of course, the desert. Now, mind you, in a lot of Orientalist writings, the desert has absolutely been the object of fascination of Orientalists. And then finally, and I want to try to get you guys here a little bit out of the way, let's see. You see that Tintin is going to have a vacation in Egypt. Notice here, remember there's a Francophone fascination with Egypt from the days of Bonaparte. So Tintin is walking with his dog. And of course, you get to see some aspects of archaeology and the Islamic buildings. So there's a minaret here and the rest of the Islamic buildings. Look at, pay attention to the way the woman is walking. On the other side, there's a man dressed in traditional attire, but her face is covered. Now, mind you, this is not how Egyptian women, if they were Muslim, how they used to cover their faces, but this is how Hergé depicts them. Let's see. Now I'm going to take you to something called the Universal Exhibitions, and there were several, and they were all over Europe, actually. And if I look away from you, it's because I'm actually looking at my other computers for my notes. But there, the Universal Exhibitions in Paris happened in 1855, 1867, and 1878, but they were not the only ones. They happened all over Europe. So I'm going to start with the image on the left. Notice that there's an African troupe. They're dancing, and notice that they are bare feet. And the public who's there seems to be quite the image of the dainty European who's nicely dressed in Western attire, very fashionable, and staring in awe at these dancers. So that was the exhibition that happened in Paris in 1889. In the middle, there is this colonial exhibition of 1931, and here, who does it depict? What we think are, of course, Arabs in North Africa. But mind you, look at here, there are two white women who are being carried on a camel by a darker man, right? By the brown man. And there are all these kids around them who are white and who are playing and staring at the camel in fascination. And then to look at another, now this is, it says right here that it's an ethnographic exposition. Sorry. If I try to minimize my, here, I'm not sure if you guys can see me, but if you look at this one, and this is a Douja Mamelouk, so it tells you that there's this exhibit that's happening. Notice how the woman is, her breasts are showing, and on the bottom, you see that there's a price, an entrance price, which really is interesting because think about it this way. Not only were the French, the Belgians, the Italians present in Africa, but they also imported Africans for the purpose of exhibiting their bodies. And they, of course, made money off of this endeavor. Now, something that the French created was the Ministry of War. I'm sure you could not imagine that there'd be a Ministry of War, but in this sense, if you look at these posters, which are all propaganda posters, you see that there is an absolutely positive image of what it means to be part of this war. So over here to the left, you have the white Frenchman who's standing very proudly, and it says here, engagez-vous, which means that you should join the service. And here it has what I suspect is Indochina, based upon over here what you see of the buildings and how the people here look like. They made them a little confusing in the sense that you can't really tell if they are from Indochina, or do you think that they could be from Africa? So there's also a play on color of skin. But they seem really happy. These people here, the so-called indigenous, are happy, are reassured. The local people, are the men here, are not fully dressed. And here the Frenchman stands very proudly erect, watching over everyone. In the other image, which is, it's called Journée de l'Armée d'Afrique, which is the Day of the African Army, it is rare for you to see the Africans fighting side by side the French. However, what many do not know about is that the French recruited many for the Foreign Legion, and they had North Africans, but especially Senegalese and all sorts of other Africans that they colonized, they had them join. Now, a parenthesis I'd like to open here. You know, it made it in North Africa something really difficult not to join, because in a place like Tunisia, there was something called the third colonial, which meant that if you asked for French citizenship or you engaged in the French army, that you would get a third of your salary that would be added. We're talking during colonization, there was no birth control. People had a lot of children. So imagine a third of your salary would make a big difference to the income of any family. However, here's the catch, and you will think about the catch later on when I show you what happens with the women and their nude photos. If because of the fact that the Zaytuna Mosque and the sheikhs of Tunisia, so the religious authority said that it was a sin in Islam if you accepted French citizenship, which meant you do not get to be buried in a Muslim cemetery. So this put a lot of pressure on people who wanted to become French citizenship for the purposes of solely of money, and yet had the local pressures of not doing so for religious reasons. Now, mind you, if you think about it, it really has nothing to do with religion as much as it had to do with the idea of nationhood and nationalism, which, by the way, also it was a completely different notion than what we think of it today. Because nationalism under colonized nations is completely different than what we see and what you describe as nationalism today in America. So again, I'm a linguist, so I work on terms, and terms matter a lot. And in the case of the word indigène, which means indigenous, oftentimes, and Steve and I were just talking about this, indigenous studies in America. That term indigenous in America and the way we perceive it is completely different from what the French colonial powers and writers created with the word indigenous. Indigenous was a colonial term that was to call the people, the original inhabitants of North Africa, but it also came with several other terms that were derogatory. In this instance, the word indigène is derogatory. So here we're going to look to the left. In Lyon, France in 1894, there's another colonial exhibition. And it tells you here that these are Black villages. It has 160 indigenous people in it. And you see them here, you know, the object of the camera. This man here in the middle is actually a postcard, and he's Algerian. It was part of the series that the French created, and the commentary on it was they're barbarians, but they are very manly. So it sort of played on the trope of masculinity, and it hit manliness and manhood at its core, because remember, colonization also plays on the theme of masculinity, because on the one hand, it's saying they're barbarians, but they're very sexy and they're very sexual. And on the other hand, it says, no, they are effeminate. So it actually demasculinizes local men and what they call the indigenous. So it's a play on both sides. And then finally here, this is actually a journal. Now remember, periodicals were very popular, especially say between the end of the 19th century through the 1940s, when the French under the Vichy government started really censoring anything that came locally from, say, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. But still here, again, as part of French propaganda, was to have Journal des Voyages. So this is the journal, a magazine on travel, and it features the Tuareg tribe, which exists actually, there's a big tribe, but it exists in places like in Libya, in Algeria, and some in Morocco. So it shows you here. Notice that the Frenchman has a gun. Look at his very masculine mustache. And then it shows the fighter on a camel. And here there are other Tuareg that are under, and they look like fighters. And we're not sure if they're fighting as part of the French or what they're doing exactly. But the fact is that the Frenchman next to them, if he's not threatened, that means that they are fighting side by side, which is, again, you know, a myth that the French created. So the making of the freak, the concept of the freak, I actually, believe it or not, there are people who study this and have books on it. And what is it to create a freak? When you think of the word a freak of nature, well, the freak is created because fundamentally differences exist between people, but it does not mean that someone who is different is necessarily freaky. However, the French created this. So I'm going to start with La Dépêche Coloniale, which is another illustrated journal to the far left. This is Marianne, the symbol of French democracy and civilization. So she's way up here. And notice to the left of her, there's an elephant, which I would suspect, you know, perhaps also there's an Asian, those cover Indochina. And then there's the African, okay? Again, the African is always depicted in not a very pretty way. And he's dark, so all you see is basically a shade. And of course, once again, he's naked. Okay, it's the nudity of the African, the image of the barbarian. In the middle here, it's called Agitation in Morocco. And you see that there is a Moroccan man on his donkey. We don't know what he's saying. We don't know what he's doing, but most likely it is a depiction of some sort of spiritual rite that is being respected by the locals. Mind you here, this is a reminder that the West is the center of rational thinking and of everything being rational, mathematical, and the East, whether it be North Africa or the rest of Africa, is the place of spirituality and the juju and the black magic and all things that make no sense, right? Notice here that the black man here, okay, is depicted as wearing at least a Moroccan turbouche on his head, etc., but he also is half naked. And then finally, the image of the freak making use of the black body. Now, mind you, I don't know if you can see this very well, but it's a white baby angel. She's smoking. Of course, she's almost nude. And what gets depicted is that, of course, her bottom is shown like it is disproportionate in size. And it's not a caricature, because when people look at images, they actually believe that this is a representation, and a representation can only be something that is real. So this is the making of the freak. Now I move on to the making of the exotic. Oftentimes we use the word exotic, and I don't think we realize in America how heavy and how loaded of a term it is, because here, these photos from Algeria, and they're somewhere between 1830 until 1870. So from the beginning of French colonization until 1870, mind you, French colonization in Algeria does not end until 1962. But the theme is they're barbarian, but they're manly, okay? And this is what shows there are a lot of men. They're depicted as smoking what you guys know of as a hookah. Back in these times in North Africa, it's not tobacco, it's a kind of hashish, was not illegal, okay? It was called keef, and it was very popular in a place like Morocco, less so in Tunisia and Algeria, but still popular. And people smoked it, and they knew when to smoke it. It was a social event, but it's not until French colonization comes and decides to ban all these things, actually. So it was banned eventually. In the other image, this is in Geneva. So the Swiss, believe it or not, even though we think of Switzerland as being such a peaceful nation, it actually did it did participate in the act of orientalizing the East. And therefore, if you look at it here, it tells you also, you have 200 indigenous people. And speaking to the prowess of men, you see here what possibly is a king or a tribal chief, and next to him another strong man. And then there's a woman here on her knees with a baby. Okay, so still there's, first of all, it positions the man as the strong person and the woman as the weak. Mind you, in the background, you see this. It goes hand in hand with this idea of the East being somewhere, who knows who they're worshiping. They're not praying. It's not an Islamic prayer, so we don't think that it's that they're being depicted as Muslims per se, but probably animists or pagans. But they seem to have some sort of religious ritual going on in the back. Now we get to human zoos. And I think this always shocks people to discover that the human zoo includes the exotic, the freak, and the animal. And you know that that zoos exist today and have animals in it. Well, in 1931, when there was the colonial exhibit in Paris, it actually encouraged people to come and visit the human zoo. Who was in the human zoo? Anyone that resembled something that seemed different than what the French had. So on the left here, again, you see that it tells you how much it costs to enter the human zoo. So not only did the French make money in Africa, taking all their resources from Africa, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, but they also imported, okay, when it was useful, the bodies of African to be showcased in human zoos in places like in Paris. So you see that poster here, okay, it's a propaganda poster, it's inviting people to come. And then here, there's a whole paragraph about this and explains to you why is it that you should come and what's happening. You should not miss this exciting event. Meanwhile, look at the African bodies that are on grounds here, women, children standing. And then finally, I find it fascinating to have the Black woman dressed in traditional clothing and around her all these men. In fact, even the young boy here has a role. He gets to stand erect around a woman who's sitting, and they all seem to be very macho, proud of their mustaches, standing around something that was something to take a picture with, as if you were going to the museum and you saw a statue and you wanted to take a picture with. It was definitely a way not only to dehumanize women, but Africans in general. Now, the civilizing mission. Mind you here, look at the images I choose here. And here, these are the colonial troops. This is Africa with the Marianne looking over it, the symbol of French independence and freedom and democracy. And it says Africa explored and civilized. And then the one here says 2 little tourists in Algeria. If you notice, all these posters have something in common, which was the fact that it looks like it's a peopleless land. And this is a trope that has repeated itself in colonization. You've seen it. It still exists today. If you want to build an argument around colonization, you say that you're going to this place that doesn't have too many people, and something very similar to what happened with Columbus coming to America. So why? First of all, we have the Frenchmen here standing. They look nice, they look clean, they're armed, and next to them a camel. There are a few trees here, but it's the desert. Africa, same thing, it needs to be explored and civilized, but mind you, there's nothing over it other than Marianne. And then finally, the two little tourists that are exploring, notice there's a cactus, nothing much going on, and the French are exploring these lands. Now, this is when I have to give you the rated R rating, what is it called? Warning. So it's very interesting because for many years it was very difficult for me to work on these topics because it just hit home and it was too close to me. And I find them, of course, intellectually disturbing, but this knowledge needs to be shared and put out there for everyone to be able to understand what does it mean to have colonialism and to see it practically happening. So these colonial photos of women, they're specifically Algerian. And there's a very clear division that Scott talks about. He says there's two transcripts concerning the Arab world. He says there's a private transcript and there's a public transcript. And when the French arrived, specifically in North Africa, they seem to have a very, very discomfort with the idea that these North African women are hidden to them, which means that they're veiled. So what do? Mind you, this Algerian Berber girl has her hair covered, but her bosom is showing. This one, the same thing. And they found it very fascinating to keep this whole institution of the veil upon the women that they asked to pose nude for them, and specifically to show their breasts. And you can ask me more about it in the question and answer because I have a lot more to say about this. But for now, I'll move on to the next images. So this is a very famous one to the left that you often see. It's very disturbing because if you hear all these conversations about veiling and it being such an issue to Muslims, but specifically to non-Muslims, it is ironic, and I've always said this, how a piece of cloth can bother people so much. But this is what happened. There is an origin to this Orientalism slash sexism slash racism that has historically occurred. So the photographer here, a French man, of course, asks this woman to keep her veil, okay? And most likely she probably wanted to keep her veil because you do not want to be identified, because you would get in trouble with all the men in your tribe. Algeria happened to be a very tribal society. And he asks her to show her breasts. Now, mind you, nobody is going to ever go out like this. So it was so obvious that it was to pose. And the reason why this happened and why women consented to it, and I'll tell you in a second why. In other images, it'll tell you exactly why, because you'll actually see the physical evidence of the plague. But this is how Algerian women went out. Notice they're wearing pants. It was apparently a very elegant pants made with organza fabric. Above it, when you go outside, you put on this that's called a sefseri. So it can be either cotton or silk. And they do this face covering thing. Again, this is only when you go outside. So private transcript versus public transcript. Now, in colonial postcards, the French couldn't really make up their minds. On the one hand, they depicted these savages, these barbarians who were walking around naked. But I want to juxtapose that thought with the fact that they were also bothered by the fact that in North Africa, women were completely covered. So what do? And I'm going to show you this postcard again. The soldiers got to send, and all the people who the colonists who live in the North Africa sent these postcards to France back home, which is why you see that there's a stamp here. So this woman, for a North African woman of the time, where women were supposed to actually have a little bit of meat on their bones because of all the droughts, the famines, working out in the fields, etc., is quite thin, okay, which starts to tell us something about, could have been going through one of the famines, the plague, all of that they had. And if you haven't read Albert Camus, I highly recommend to read his novel, La Peste. I think it's translated as the pest or the plague. What is more disturbing about transgressing colonial bodies is sexualizing motherhood. Now, I want to also, once again, I use the verb juxtaposing a lot because I want you to think about what locally happens with motherhood. Motherhood in Arab culture in general is very elevated in status. So a woman actually, as she gets older and as she goes through motherhood and then becomes a grandmother, etc., she reaches the highest status in the family. In a sense, I would actually argue that Arab families are very matriarchal, except that the matriarchy is accentuated through age and experience. So a woman who has had children and they've grown up and have been married and have had kids has, if you will, a higher status than the one who, for example, was married to one of the sons in the family and did not conceive. So there's this really, the photo to the far left here is a young Algerian. Okay, you can tell that they're okay, pretty well off, but the French poses her and they find the act of breastfeeding, you know, something sexual. The fact is that these women, and you can tell that she was a country woman because of the way she's dressed, they never felt or thought about that. If a baby was crying for a mother's milk and was hungry, then they just, you know, fed them. The tradition would be that the men would look away, except that the French photographer, of course, finds it to be the object of not only his camera, but the object of his gaze. This one right here in the middle is actually titled Algerian Women Having Tea. And I have never seen anyone in North Africa have tea naked, by the way. So this is once again staged. And they're showing their faces. Some studies say that women who have these cone hats, specifically in Tunisia, were prostitutes, and they were mostly Tunisian Jewish women who were the prostitutes. And then you see this woman here. You see all her bones here. That is a sign that she most likely was posing because she was going to get a little bit of money, and it could have been during one of the droughts, the famines, something was going on. So there's this idea of completely taking advantage of these women bodies who otherwise would choose to be very concealed. Now, post-colonial times, I'm going to look now and show you something recent, which goes back to the original argument that I was trying to make to you, which is that I think that illegal immigration, what is called the harga, and the harga in Arabic means burning, and it is called the harga, so the act of illegally migrating, say from the shores of Tunisia in the south of the Mediterranean to Italy, to Lampedusa. Lampedusa is an island that's closer to Tunisia than it is to Italy. Except that in Tunisia, we didn't have the military strength to claim it. So we gave it up to Italy, but it is full of Tunisians because they can actually take a little boat and go there. Here's the problem. The first ship is a very typical ship. So for the harega these days, I hear that the latest price is actually goes up to $5,000 to $7,000 to get on they're called the boats of death. The reason why they're called the burners, literally from Arabic, is because they are taught before they perform the harga to burn all of their documents. So they get rid of their national identification cards. And if they have a passport, they also burn that. And the reason why they do this is because once they get hopefully caught by the Italian police and taken to a miserable detention center, they don't ever want to be identified through any interpreter to, for example, speak Arabic and to know that they're speaking Tunisian Arabic specifically and repatriated to Tunisia. So they don't ever want to do that. So they pretend like they're Turkish. They pretend they're from Crete. They pretend they're Lebanese. They'll pretend to be all sorts of something just to be sent to that country. At least that's what they think in their brains. And of course they always pack, because of course there are these pirates who have this for a job on the shores of Tunisia and Libya. It's a very lucrative business. Usually the people who do this business tip off the police, the National Guard, etc. But sometimes the disaster is too big and they can't contain it. So in this one, this is a photo of one of the Tunisian shores. And what you see is the clothes and the life jackets of people who were on this boat. So the whole shore is actually full of little boats and trash coming from the sea and tons of life jackets, which tells you that the people never made it. And here's another picture of people trying to save those who appeared on the shore. To show you some statistics of illegal immigration in numbers, specifically look here. This is an alarming number. So between January and May of 2019, we estimate that there were 4,351. And Tunisia, it says that there's 8,206, and in Libya, 25,380. By the way, Libya has some very, very miserable detention centers for everyone who comes from the rest of Africa. They have put women and children and men into slavery. And the circumstances of these people are absolutely horrendous. Of course, Libya, it's not a democracy, doesn't have a stable state. There's so much instability that of course they can get away with doing something like that. Notice that between January and May 2020, 151% increase in the number of illegal immigrants. Remember, I always want to tell everyone to be very careful with the statistics, even though it's from the UNHCR, which is a very reliable, and AFP reported this too. It's a reliable source. However, the number of people who are not accounted for exceeds these numbers. I wanted to bring in a little bit the Syrian refugee crisis. Why? Even though I'm talking about colonization and everything else, because we estimate that there are between 7 to 10 million Syrians who are either already in Europe or trying to get into Europe. Here's the thing. Germany has been one of the nicest countries to the Syrians in taking them away from the war that they left behind in Syria. However, what is puzzling in this is that everyone thinks that when we have a refugee crisis or a migration and legal immigration crisis, that means that we don't have enough resources or spaces for these people. That is not true. Europe is actually not producing enough babies, unlike all of us in the Arab world who are, and therefore there are places they are not only sore of, they need more unskilled and skilled labor all over Europe. In fact, there was one small little Italian village that was running out of young people to live in it. What did they do? They decided to bring refugees to this little village. And all who was left in this village in Italy were the senior citizens. And they just wanted to have a young life back to the village. Because of course they didn't want to leave. All their kids had left. And it was a complete success story. In fact, NPR featured it one day because they gave jobs to these people and they were refugees from all over the place. So it became a vibrant international community, and the elders of that village just loved having little kids running around, and the commerce picked up and the economy picked up in this small village in Sicily. So the idea that we have no room for refugees, and specifically in Europe, but I would argue everywhere else in the world, is actually a myth. And this is the ugly face of colonization, illegal immigration. So here there are some Tunisians trying to swim to make it to shore. And here is in Lampedusa, this is the Italian police. And these are mostly Libyans and Tunisians who are going straight to the detention center. And I call this the ugly face of colonization because with any colonization in Europe, the concept of reparations has never occurred to anyone in Europe. And in the example of the French government, it was not until Sarkozy apologized for the murder of 45,000 Algerians in one day in a village in Algeria. He reluctantly apologized for that, but fundamentally the French as a government and as official authorities have never come out and apologized for what they have done during colonization. And finally, Steve, am I okay on time? I can't see you guys, so I can't tell if you've fallen asleep or not.
You're fine.
Okay. So I want to read something to you since I'm speaking about Italy, which is you can find the PDF free online for Umberto Eco, the beautiful Italian linguist, philosopher, and author. He writes in his collection of essays called Inventing the Enemy. And listen carefully to this. It's a beautiful story. He says, and I quote, "Some years ago in New York, I found myself in conversation with a taxi driver whose name I had difficulty in placing. He was, he explained, Pakistani, and asked where I came from. Italy, I replied. He asked how many of us there were and was surprised we were so few and that our language wasn't English. Then he asked me who our enemies were. In response to my sorry, he explained patiently that he wanted to know who were the people against whom we have fought through the centuries over land claims, ethnic rivalry, border incursions, and so forth. I told him we are not at war with anyone. He explained that he wanted to know who were our historical enemies, those who kill us and whom we kill. I repeated that we don't have any, that we fought our last war more than half a century ago, starting, moreover, with one enemy and ending with another. He wasn't satisfied. How can a country have no enemies? Getting out of the taxi, I left a $2 tip to compensate him for our indolent Italian pacifism. And only then did it occur to me how I should have answered. It is not true that we Italians have no enemies. We have no outside enemies, or rather we are unable to agree on who they are because we are continually at war with each other. Pisa against Lucca, Guelphs against Ghibellines, North against South, fascists against partisans, mafia against state, Berlusconi's government against the judiciary. It was a pity that during that time, the two governments headed by Romano Prodi had not yet fallen. Otherwise, I could have explained to the taxi driver what it meant to lose a war through friendly fire. And then he goes on and he says, having an enemy is important not only to define our identity, but also to provide us with an obstacle against which to measure our system of values, and in seeking to overcome it, to demonstrate our own worth. So when there is no enemy, we have to invent one. Look at the generous flexibility with which the skinheads of Verona would, just to identify themselves as a group, choose anyone not belonging to the group as their enemy. And so we are concerned here not so much with the almost natural phenomenon of identifying an enemy who is threatening us, but with the process of creating and demonizing the enemy. End of quote. So how do we decolonize our mindsets? I'd like to suggest for all of you and for your young, brilliant minds to first have awareness of this colonial knowledge. And I just presented to you a very small glimpse of it. And then to reach a better understanding of this creation of a dichotomy east-west that we are so sure of, as if it's, fixed knowledge. And then I think that understanding the hierarchy of knowledge, and for example, how is it that in Western Academy, knowledge is definitely based upon this idea of a Judeo-Christian understanding of the world, as opposed to perhaps pledging for a Judeo-Christian Islamic knowledge, because that's what the truth about our knowledge is, doesn't really exist. I want to suggest to you comprehending the colonized perspectives. So I say that it's not enough to be an anti-racist or an anti-imperialist without the duty of acquiring the historical novel surrounding the the oppression systems and linking them to economic gains. And then what can we do differently as citizens in our communities? I think that we should encourage everyone to seek knowledge, especially as Americans or as citizens living in America, citizens of the world. It doesn't really matter where we're from. We all have this access to knowledge. So the internet, smartphones, free public libraries, and therefore not to know, I think, is solely put on us. You cannot say, oh, the public school system didn't teach me the reality of history, or I never heard about critical race theory, which is really just teaching history. So we need to question more of these systems. And then I think it's important to seek out a role for ourselves in establishing a more just society at the micro level already. The history of isms is very important, and nothing is just is. Historical contexts matter as they reflect much of our present traumas and influence our futurities. I'd like to also see us instill a different value system, and this is what I propose. I propose, since we have maxed out on economic growth and gain, that it may be intelligent for us to think about alternative modes of operating, such as social capital and education as a highly esteemed value, which they are not currently. And then finally, I am curious to hear from you all, your questions, and what is your experience in encountering and how you define the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mamelouk. That was an outstanding talk. You wove together for us. Thank you so much.
Let me get the lights. I knew I started without the light, so.
Problem.
And now I am ready to jot down your questions.
So, do you all have any questions?
I have questions for you to maybe warm up the conversation, because I know that students are sometimes reluctant. I could start picking on you guys. I see your names, by the way. So let me ask you this. Which PowerPoint slide did you think was one that really, really shocked you or spoke to you? Dave, can I pick on you? You're muted.
So yeah, it's difficult to pick out one.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the images that come from colonial understandings of the nature of women, some of those were disturbing, to say the least.
Did you know that such things existed?
What?
Did you know that such images existed?
Yes, I was aware of that. And we actually have, you know, if you look back in our National Geographic Society magazine, early years, there the depiction of African women was, yeah, a little prurient. I don't know if you've looked back at.
So you're saying they're Orientalist, since
But
Dr. Stern's students are being introduced to Orientalism, you're saying that they are Orientalist.
which?
The images in National Geographic are Orientalist.
Oh, no, that's not what I was saying.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're appealing to sort of a what's the word I'm trying to think of? Showing off the females' bodies. I don't know if you've looked back at it or National Geographic from 50, 100 years ago. But yeah.
Okay.
Are you saying that the National Geographic, their more after like a lustful image rather than of information based.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I also thought that the covers of the Tintin books shocked me because I never really think to look at something so innocent in and find something like wrong with it. Like I'd never think of a children's book in such a malignant way, even though that there are some malignant factors correlated with them.
And thank you, Liam. And that's how racism, when people say, oh, but I'm not racist. But even saying that without you as a child, and not you, just Liam, I'm just saying in general, you know, I read Tintin to my kids too. They were fed those depictions, those photos, those images, and they stay in the brain. Fundamentally, this idea of a racial hierarchy is something that we learn how to ingest early on in life. And therefore, what I'm proposing is that as we become more aware of what has happened historically, we are more able to stand and have a critique, and just completely are able to dismantle these systems of oppression, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm also reminded of some of the depictions by British travelers of the Native Americans as they would give depictions of their clothing and different ways.
And Dave, thank you for that, because the idea of me exposing you today to what the French and the Belgians did and the Europeans is actually a way for me to say that we should shine that same light upon us for what has happened in America and has happened everywhere in the world. And it still means that we are able to criticize the empire even when the empire is us. And therefore, and I think that is very important to be able to do that. I think if you are in college and you're learning concepts pertaining to critical thinking, that not only are you there to amass knowledge about certain topics, but you're able to critically relate topics such as to see what European colonization did in Africa and be able, in a sense, to see those patterns all over the place in the world, but also at home, right? In the United States, in America. Layla.
So because of the refugee crisis and because of these new increases of North African and overall African populations in Europe, there's actually been a rebound. You would think that maybe because there is a bigger inclusion of North Africans, I'm specifically thinking about France, that there would be more of an understanding and of their cultures, and these Orientalist ideas to kind of dissipate. But at the same time, you're seeing kind of a rise of conservatism and more of a hate towards the other, especially in France. With I'm thinking of the ban on the hijabs. This is an attack. So I just wanted to hear your opinions on what you think would help stop this hate towards the other, the feeling of focusing so much on the cultural divides.
Thank you, Layla, so much for that question. That is so pertinent. In fact, you see that present today in France, if you look at the results of the election. In fact, Le Pen is really going up there. And I would have never believed that one day Zemmour would be ever even a candidate. He is originally a North African Jewish man, by the way, which is ironic that he would turn around and have such racist arguments. However, I think with the case of France, and it's not only France, but it's specific for France, that France itself as a country, as a nation, has this very big malaise with its historical, with its colonial history. There are several historians in France who work side by side with the historians from Algiers. And to see the reports and their documentaries, you see that they are literally depressed as professors because the truth hasn't come out. The French government has never initiated reparations, and I'm not sure that it ever will. The French has made sure that when people go through public school, that they don't learn much about North Africa and do not learn the truth. The truth about post-colonization is that the French allowed for many North African men, specifically from Algeria and Tunisia mostly, but also from Morocco, to go to France and work. They wanted them to be migrant workers. Now, mind you, they did not allow them to have their wives and their children until 1979 with the passing of a law that was called le rapatriement familial. So it was a law that allowed families to get together again in France. But here's the problem. Well, there are many problems. First of all, it used the migrant workers from North Africa. They were unskilled and skilled workers with very little education. They wanted to go to France, of course, to make money and be able to just send the cash back to their families. And then when they were living there, the French decided that they were dating too many French women, so we're better off building them the HLM around Paris. So they built ghettos. That's never a good idea to have a ghetto. You put a population somewhere and you tell them it's yours, and it puts people and it segregates people. And that's exactly what they did. And the segregation is not only racial, it's socioeconomic. So they built these ghettos around in the periphery of France, of Paris, and put all these skilled / unskilled workers in them. Then they told them eventually they could bring their wives and children. And again, the French never apologized for what they had did in North Africa, nor did they ever send a check. Because remember, fundamentally for a country to make peace, it needs to make peace with its history itself. Look at Germany, how sensitive it is with its history. There are so many malaises towards it. And even looking at Americans towards the Germans, so many malaises towards it because not having done the right decision at the right time. And therefore, with the French never having A, the knowledge, and B, a system of reparation, and C, an apology, an official apology, and an acknowledgement for the Algerians say they killed 1 million. The French say 300,000. That's a big difference in numbers. So if the French and the Algerians could just come together and agree upon numbers, agree upon the massacres, it wasn't just one. They had atomic bombing tested in the Algerian desert. I mean, they were doing all sorts of experiments. They were also doing psychiatric experiments. Fanon writes about this. And so this is why French society, of course, it's going to be very divided. And plus the right all over the world, the alt-right and the right is rising everywhere. And there's no difference, by the way, between a hardcore Republican in America and a conservative in France and an Islamist in the Arab world. They all can have a great dinner together and agree because they are all conservative and ultra conservative, and they like that conservatism in thought. And that's never a good thing. Societies should be a diverse, comfortable space that includes all people. So why is it that France today, I still have hope that the right will not win, as it has proved itself several years ago. I think socialism in France is at the core of what we think of as being French values, but I could be proven wrong. I also think that, despite the rise in racism in France, that there is too much mixing in the population for the right to really win. There are a lot of mixed marriages, and those people had children. So what does it mean to be French today? I mean, Islam is the second religion in France. What do you do with that? So again, France is a prime example of a nation that has a complete malaise, which with its colonial past. And I think that in order for us to all move forward, a place like France needs to A, reparations, and B, again, an apology for the atrocities that were committed. Without that, it just means that we still have populations after populations and generations after generations of people who have not rid themselves of the malaise. And in fact, there was a trial that happened. And these Algerian women took the general who had tortured them. And I don't remember if he killed someone. This is just a few years ago. And they took him they tried him in France. And it was one of the hardest moments to see that man says, I have no regrets. I did it for my nation. I did it for France. And he was in his late 80s. And he, of course, in order for him to be able to go to the other world and have peace, he was convinced that he did the right thing, which is why I always caution against nationalism. Nationalism is just an imagined community, as Benedict Anderson says. Nationalism doesn't serve well. I think the concept of a citizen at the individual level is a lot more productive over saying, oh, I am, this idea of nationalism. Oh, I'm Tunisian. Oh, I'm American. Well, what does that really mean? Fundamentally, these concepts are just accidents of birth. And therefore, if we looked at these things as accidents of birth and prioritize the notion of a citizen, which we are no longer taught in public schools in America or anywhere else in the world, we would think of the world in our communities differently and in the world at large differently. We would be interested in contributing at the communal level, at the national level, at the international level. It means as a citizen, I pick up trash, whether I'm in upstate New York, in North Africa, or in China. That's what it means to be a global citizen. I hope I answered your question. Liam.
When talking about the United States, do you think that like it is more important to serve your community, as in like your neighborhood and like your like town, rather than like your country? Like, would you say like it's more important to like serve those around you rather than like the whole?
So it's a good question you ask, considering that we are still in a pandemic. And I think the pandemic has proved us that this model of capitalism that allows you to have pizza at Trader Joe's from Italy and a Chinese dish that comes from Peking and at Trader Joe's, and all these extravagant foods and commodities and products and goods that we buy. I think the pandemic, and I'm sure you've heard, Liam, about the chain of production and all these things, has encouraged all of us to think more locally. But do I think that we should only serve our communities locally? No. If you were to ask me, should I go tomorrow and have an internship in the Congress, then I would say absolutely, Liam, you go for it. Why not? So the idea of serving your community and thinking about your local space does not detract you from thinking state or federal levels. On the contrary, it means if you care about your community, that you care about everyone at large, I think. So do I support more local activism? Do I support thinking, especially since we are going economically through a recession, do I support us thinking more local purchasing and community-based? Yes. But it does not mean that that detracts from national or international activism. Does that answer your question, Liam?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Stephen, you don't have a question for me? Emma.
I was just thinking about, I learned in an Italian class like that, there's this kind of push towards like making, all these European countries colonized. I just think it's interesting that there's this like pattern in Europe right now that they all colonize these African countries and then refuse to like make them citizens. Like in Italy, similar to France, I don't know if it's still happening, but they were saying like, they're not fully Italian citizens. They're not allowed to be unless they have some sort of birthright in Italy or something?
It's not that bad yet. It's not that bad yet. But you know, it's funny because already Italy has a lot of political issues internally. But they seem to think, a lot of Italians, that they see, for example, and this is why I call it the ugly illegal immigration, the ugly face of colonization, because Italy now has its parks full of. Go ahead.
Second. Class, I'm really sorry, but I'm suffering about a food poisoning. And so I'm going to have to step away. Douja, I'm going to ask you to close this.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
so sorry.
Go, Steve. So where, wait, who asked the question? Where are you? Emma, right? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so in Italy, the situation is a little different, but you also make a very good point, Emma, is that Italy, even Italy, was a colonial power. It colonized even Libya, even though it wasn't a long period of time, and we don't think of it as having done the same thing as the French did in North Africa, and the stay wasn't as long, but still. Italy has a lot of political and internal issues, a lot of corruption and all that, but it does not mean that Italy cannot actually absorb all the illegal immigrants. I want to suggest an idea that actually comes from medieval Arab travelers, okay, which is a borderless world. In that sense, what happens in this idea, guys, remember, borders are imagined. They don't really exist. So this idea and the idea of borders is actually fed by things like nationalism and patriotism. But not to detract from your question and to my attempt to answer your question, Emma, what happens in Italy is that the alt-right is also on the rise, okay? And therefore, they're the ones who are the anti-immigration, anti-immigrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you go to Italy, you see all these African migrants from all over Africa who are sleeping in parks. I feel to what extent that is the slap across the face that colonization did, because it definitely, it colored Europe differently to see all these immigrants, but it does not mean that Europeans cannot absorb them. If there were mechanisms in place, they would completely be able to absorb them. In fact, they did the experiment in Ireland with a small town with 50 refugee families. And the model was extremely successful. It was about integrating 50 families. So they're from all over the place. Somalia, Afghanistan, all the countries, Yemen, that need the help. Instead of having, for example, an NGO or the state take care of them or something, they had families be in charge of integrating these individuals in their society and locally. So for example, if I'm an Irish family living in this village, I was in charge of registering the kids to school. So I would go with them on the first day to school. I would say, oh, by the way, I've adopted this family. And so they were invited to dinners. Whenever they needed help, they had someone from the community help. And it was a completely successful model of integration. And by the way, I'm sensitive about using the word integration because integration and assimilation are words that they're very colonial and we really love using them. But what does that mean? Does it mean that you have to abandon your culture? If you're from Afghanistan and you wear a hijab, do you have to take off your hijab because you're in Italy? No, but it also means that the local people are going to make sure that you learn the language, that you go to school and learn how to read and write in Italian or in English, whatever language that you need to learn, but you're not put on the outskirts. Now, mind you, in America, we don't do the same thing. So Italy, believe it or not, could use all these people. It's just that, again, propaganda and the extreme right and the idea that, oh my gosh, our unemployment rates are so high. Well, I think there's enough in this world for everyone. If we all just ate enough, if we all ate to our hunger and not, decided to have caviar for dinner, it's like it's the excess that causes other people not to have anything. It's our excess that causes the kids of Yemen to be dying of hunger. right? Did that answer you, Emma?
Yeah, definitely.
I think more it's a political issue as opposed to, and again, Italy also hasn't apologized, by the way, and hasn't sent the check.
I think it's just interesting that there is like a rise kind of around the world of this alt-right movement. Of
Everywhere.
Yeah. It's just
Everywhere. And when people say, oh, the Islamists and ISIS and Al Qaeda and all this in the Arab world, their victims are mostly Arabs and Muslims, by the way. So it's not as if it's anything shocking. Don't ever think that the Islamists of the Arab world cannot have a great dinner with a hardcore Republican or a conservative in France. No, no, no. They have a lot in common. That's what makes the difference, Emma. It's not about nationality. It's about intellect and character. You, who you become friends with, means that you have an interest in common with someone. It just depends upon you, right? So I think it's the intellect of people that brings a community together, and character. If you're kind, if you're a nice person, and then you can say also about all the addition of a club. So I like to collect stamps and you like to collect stamps, things like that. But fundamentally, I really like to make my students aware of the dangers of club mentality, which is exactly what you're seeing all over the world. I'm very cautious with club mentality because it's very tribal and / very provincial. And I have decided that I don't appreciate the provincialism. Victoria, and then Dave.
Excuse me. Kind of going off of what Emma said, I'm an Italian major, so I've dealt with a bit of Italian studies.
So do you like Umberto Eco?
I haven't read him, but
put him on your list. He's
I
awesome.
absolutely will.
Yes.
But one thing I learned is that Italians don't necessarily have the proper term to discuss race. The term like race, and if you were to translate it exactly, is meant to be ethnicity. So they don't have the proper terminology for sort of having that discussion. How would you suggest they go about having that discussion without having a differentiation between these terms?
So I'm going to draw some parallels. One of them is the concept of sexuality in the Arab world, which is an extremely fluid concept. You are not gay, homosexual, heterosexual in the Arab world. Sex is a performance and not an identity. And Westerners have a very hard time understanding this, which means that gender as a description and a concept is extremely fluid in the Arab world. How do we know this? We know this because the medieval poets, we have their poetry, it's still around, and it tells us that there was love happening between boys and girls and girls and girls and boys, and it was never an identity, okay? So that's one. The second thing is that it also, I'm going to draw another parallel, Victoria, for you, which is in language. The French Academy has had to deal with the problem of the feminine. How is it that we have words in French that are masculine, and in order for us to be gender inclusive, the French Academy has had to do a lot of hard work to add all these words to French. The Italians, and I will ask specifically when I see my Italian friends this summer about this, I don't think they've stopped calling someone black the negro, did they? There you go. But in America, we're hypersensitive to this, but it's ironic. We're hypersensitive to terms, and yet we haven't made peace with our history. Okay, I have had college professors look at me and tell me, I am not responsible for slavery in America. My ancestors didn't own slaves. As opposed to saying, we have a collective understanding. We have signed a social contract that brings us all together. We as a society have responsibility for slavery. And therefore, for me to say, oh, I'm white and my ancestors didn't have slaves, doesn't mean that I am absolved or I no longer have the duty to be aware of my history of slavery, because the history of slavery is my history. and it's our history. So the Italians, I'm sure, and I can find out more this summer when I ask them, are, I'm sure, going to have to modify language, right? Because that's what language does. It evolves all the time. Look at all the terms that we have come up with in English that are very American specific, but they're the needs of your generation. There are words that have come up post George Floyd, right? So I'm sure that Italians are going to eventually, if they don't already, start to have these conversations. And fundamentally, to detract from, say, the word negro, etc., is it so much, think about this, Victoria, is it the issue with the word itself, or is it in reality the behavior that we emit? Because, you know, if I were to be called, oh, il negro, the same way as you're going to call me the dark-haired or gray-haired woman, then it seems like it's just a physical description. The problem is that typically those terms are loaded. They're loaded thanks to the history of colonization. They would have not been loaded if it weren't for the history of colonization. But don't think just Italian does that. Arabic hasn't found a solution for this. The Levant, to say someone is Black, they call him abd, which means slave. So they are now having to have these conversations saying, you know, this is rude to say, and we should know that, you know, everyone is having these conversations. Everyone is having a linguistic challenge around these terms. And most importantly, again, the linguistic terms could change, but if attitudes don't, then we have a problem. Sorry, I couldn't answer exactly your answer, like linguistically, you know, I'm a linguist, so I will find this out, I promise you. Dave.
Yes, you were talking about developing knowledge, expanding our knowledge and so forth. How do you put that in the context of social media and all of the different knowledges that occur?
You asked me a very sensitive question, Dave. So here's, I'm not averse to our students being so aware as far as social media goes. I am aware, however, that cell phones and all these distractions have mentally affected our well-being. And therefore, you know, things like ADHD and anxiety and depression, all of those are on the rise. If any of these students want to become therapists in the future, they definitely will never suffer of not having a job. What I'm concerned about, what has happened in knowledge, in the sense our students have bits and pieces of knowledge that is perhaps has more of a variety than our knowledge has had. But I still tell my students to put away their phones and take an hour every night to sit down and read a book, because what I'm seeing is the inability to stay still and actually go through a book. And I feel fundamentally that, not to say that social media doesn't give you the knowledge. For example, I find myself being very slow with a TikTok. A TikTok to me is so fast that I feel like I'm unable to process the knowledge in it. I can understand what someone is saying if they are speaking slowly, but oftentimes they have recipes on it and I'm not able to follow them. You know, it doesn't mean that the knowledge doesn't exist. In a sense, they have compacted it. So it's like mini knowledge, mini information. What concerns me on the other side of social media and the consumer nature of social media is the inability to sit down and truly calm our brains down, read a book, and get into details of knowledge for a longer period of time. However, I think that also this generation has rebelled and is rebelling against for example, I've seen many from your generation say they're going to go on a social media fast. There are rehab centers around the world. One is in Seattle, others are all over China, to rid ourselves of all the social media and the phones and the computers and all that stuff. So I think that the decision, if you will, it'll just be like, you know, trying to get off of heroin. It'll be it will be a detox to go back to something, because remember, they predicted that we would not have any books. I don't know if you see the books behind me, but I still have books. And they prevented that Kindle and, you know, all these things would really detract us from ever having something called a physical book with papers on it again. And yet I still haven't seen that happen.
Book sales are on the rise too, I think.
Really?
I think so.
That's interesting. Because also a lot of the used bookstores have shut down, but a lot of them have gone online. So I mean, I'm hopeful. And plus I know that it's a matter of training your brain. So you can start with 15-minute increments and just train your brain to be able to absorb knowledge, even if it's 2 minutes that you add every day or every other day. It's not that, you know. And remember also, Dave, by the way, you acquire knowledge when you need it. Okay, for a purpose or another. You know, Victoria, you're learning Italian. Why are you learning Italian? What do you want to do with it?
I don't know. I find it interesting.
Okay, so would you like to go to Italy? Do you want to
Yeah,
have
I originally started learning so that when I was abroad in Italy last semester, but when I originally started learning it, it was because I wanted to go abroad to Italy.
There you go. Were you disappointed by your experience abroad, or did you love it?
I loved it. I just was not good at Italian.
Did you practice?
Yeah, I tried, but it's hard to do that. I was around all other American students, so
That's always the catch.
yeah.
You cannot do that. Well, anyway, does anyone have any last question? I think I put them to sleep. Well, thank you, Dave, for hanging around. And I'm sorry that Steve isn't feeling too great. Thank you, Miles. Steve,
Yes, thank you.
Layla,
Thank you. Very nice.
Rachel, Nick, Griffin, Fariha, Parcia, Griffin. I said them all, I hope. Audrey. Thank you, Rachel. Very sweet of you. Thank you. Thanks again, Dave. Have a lovely evening. Good luck with all your studies.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Ramadan Mubarak.
To you too. Thank you.